Hello everyone, welcome back to my Form 5 Ethics class at St. Anselm's Abbey School. In this video we're going to start to look at question 18, where Aquinas goes over good and evil action. We're going to give an overview of that question, and then we're going to start to look at Article 1. The big picture for question 18 is that we're finally getting into what we tend to mean in English when we talk about good and evil in ethics, good and evil action. For all the time that we've used the terminology of good and evil, going back to my 9th grade material, we've mostly been working from the convertibility of transcendentals, and we're talking about good and evil in substances, things. So good meaning healthy or functioning, working well, and evil meaning sick or bad for you or broken or in need of repair. And we did talk about the convertibility thesis and the privation theory of evil in 9th grade, but we sort of hand-waved the issue of how you go from those things to good and evil action or ethics. In 9th grade, you're not really smart enough to see the problem. But here in question 18, we're going to make that move. We're going to explicitly transition from talking about substances and things to talking about actions. And that really signals the beginning of what we primarily mean when we say ethics and good and evil. However, question 18 doesn't do it all by itself. It's actually a 3-question block, questions 18, 19, and 20, that go over all of this, and 21, depending on how you want to think about consequences. But 18 looks at the parts of the action we should be looking at. Actions are composite. And to talk about an action being good or evil, we need to know what parts are there or what parts are supposed to be there, and which things should be working well or healthy in comparison to substances to say that the action is good. What counts as evil, right, how we measure an action as good or evil, that comes later. That's question 19 and 20. We're going to focus on 19. So we're really only getting started with the question of good and evil. Even by the time we finish question 18, we've still only laid out the pieces to look at and not actually getting into the good or evil stuff just yet. We're basically combining all of the material that we've used so far in the series. Question 6, Article 1, what does it mean for an action to come from within? And a very important consequence of that. Question 8, the distinction between means and end, and willing things for their own sake and for the sake of something else. The entire account of practical reason, which my students mostly work on their own. And the convertibility of transcendentals. If you've understood those things, question 18 is pretty easy, or at least most of it is. But there is a big terminological issue to make sure we don't lose sight of something important. It's a little bit scandalous, I think, for an English speaker, the way Aquinas talks about evil. And that's because we tend to have this idea that evil implies villainy and malice and something to be judged or condemned in a very negative sense of the word, kind of a cruel term. And Aquinas just doesn't share that problem. For him, evil is just his word, malus aum, is just his word for talking about something being sick, broken, not functioning correctly, not conducive to an end for a thing. And he will therefore be, you'll see this in his examples. He's quite willing to just call any variety of things evil that we would quail at, we would really cringe. When it comes up, it might be helpful to think about using the English pair bad and evil as describing two different kinds of things. What we're going to drive at here is a famous distinction that I teach my 9th graders, and now we're going to try to see how it works. And that's the distinction between physical evil and moral evil. And I think your typical English speaker is more comfortable referring to physical evil as anything other than evil. We'll see it when we get there. Here's a table of contents for question 18 on the right. Article 1 is going to give us the privation theory of evil and justify the way we talk about action, the same way we talk about substance or being. And then in Articles 2 through 4, we'll look at the parts. There's 3 key parts of action that we need to look at for assessing whether an action is good or evil, whether it's healthy or sick, whether it is sound or deficient. Articles 5 through 7 get into something much more technical and pretty difficult. I enjoy making my students work their way through this on their own every year. We will probably not have a video on this one. We'll see. it's the really hard part of the article. We're trying to talk about kinds of action, species, whether this kind of thing is evil or good. And then finally, at the end, an easier landing, I think, especially questions or articles 8 and 9, where we're going to apply the topic of good and evil to the species talk of articles 5, 6, and 7. So ironically, even though 5 through 7 is pretty difficult, articles 8 and 9 are not that bad. Now, I do always have a little bit of a reservation teaching question 18 every year, because Aquinas does have some strange features to the way he talks about the parts in articles 2 through 4. And in Article 10, he does complicate that discussion. So I have some ambivalence myself about the way he talks about circumstances and some of the things he says there. This is a topic that could easily sidetrack us. And we're gonna try to gloss over those problems as much as possible. They're not really suitable for first level work as a student. But just be aware that there are some famous problems in here. And with that, it's time to look at Article 1. Question 18, Article 1, the privation theory of evil. Evil is the lack of a do-good. It's the negative corollary of the convertibility thesis. It's one of the more famous features of the Catholic tradition, of Catholic philosophy and theology. Aquinas is giving his own treatment here in Article 1 about how it works. He's relying on people like St. Augustine. He's relying, of course, on, as we've mentioned before, Aristotle's talk about the convertibility of being and goodness in his work. And also a source we haven't seen a lot of yet, Dionysius the Areopagite, or Pseudo-Dionysius, depending on who you ask. In ninth grade, when we did the privation theory of evil, we never really looked any deeper than it's the lack of a do-good and a couple of examples. It arises very naturally trying to talk about the convertibility argument. When we're saying at every step of the convertibility argument, when we're talking about things conducive to an end, or something is good insofar as it is actualized, it's very reasonable to think about the opposite of that. And that's really what the privation theory is. What does it mean for something to be bad for us in light of that argument? The objections in question 18, I don't think need to detain us for very long. They're all doing the same thing. We'll look at them. But all three are actually very, very famous texts on the privation theory of evil. They're not really combative objections. This is essentially Aquinas introducing us to two very famous places where the privation theory of evil is discussed at length. Two from Dionysius, or Pseudo-Dionysius, and one from Aristotle himself. And if we had time, it might be interesting to go look at the divine names text here in Objection 1 and Objection 3. But that's a long rabbit hole. Maybe that's bonus material for enterprising students. What really matters here is that we begin to think at a new level of depth about the privation theory of evil. To say more than it's just the lack of a do-good, we need to ask the kinds of questions being asked in these objections, and we need to think through the replies that Aquinas is giving. What exactly is the thing that's missing or lacking in something that we're calling evil, and specifically, how does that apply to action? So to run through them very quickly, it would seem that every human action is good and none evil, for Dionysius says in his very famous book on the divine names, evil acts not save in virtue of the good, but no evil is done in virtue of the good, therefore no action is evil. He's actually in that text talking about the way, well, if the good is the origin of all things, as we believe, and as we can show philosophically as well, then how is there any evil at all? The divine names treatment there in chapter 4 is actually talking about the existence of fallen angels. Why is there any evil at all? It's the text for the privation theory for the Middle Ages. So if evil isn't done in virtue of the good, capital T, capital G, how does it exist at all? And what it's, again, going to help us do is locate where is the evil in an action. When we say the evil is acting, evil is doing something, what does that mean? It turns out we need to say something a little more careful about that. Objection 2 is Aristotle. Nothing acts except insofar as it is in act. But a thing is evil, not according as it is in act, but according as its potentiality is void of act. Whereas insofar as its potentiality is perfected by act, it is good. And so we're actually going back to something we've seen before, the way we want, if we associate act with good, then we associate evil somehow with potency, but But act is when potency is actualized. So how does evil act? What's going on if it's some kind of potency or failed realization of potency? Therefore, nothing acts insofar as it is evil, but only according as it is good. Therefore, every action is good, and none is evil. And the second to last line there, the first therefore, that statement is true. We just need to see how it doesn't get us to the final line, the final therefore. And then finally, we go back to Dionysius. Evil, it cannot be a cause, save accidentally, as Dionysius declares. It's not essentially a cause, it's accidentally a cause. So when we say that evil is causing things, well, that means that you have an effect. Every action has some effect which is proper to it. If evil can't be a cause, then it can't generate an effect, and that means it can't be an action. Actions do generate effects, evil does not, therefore it can't have evil action. And again, the answer is important for us in terms of how where do we locate evil? When we say that evil is happening, or this is evil, evil is doing something, what do we really mean? The Sed Contra is pretty entertaining. Definitely one of my favorites. Because it turns out that Jesus does spend some time talking about humans doing evil, and therefore their evil actions. At the end. I also think that, as I tell my students every year, you should be very suspicious of any philosophy or worldview that tries to convince you there's no such thing as evil action. No one does evil ever. Suspicious. And not just because you've suffered it in life. I think that's actually sort of not as important. You should, depending on the age, I guess, at which you're watching this video, but essentially, if you're watching this video, you should already know that you yourself have done evil. You know it. So to claim otherwise is a little bit scary. So the question then is, okay, how does it work? Standard question going forward from the Sed Contra. How does this work? I want to start by just showing you a picture of the Respondeo. That's the complete text of it. And I've formatted it a little bit, not so that we can read it at length, just a visual. Almost everything written in that Respondeo is just the privation theory of evil as the corollary of the convertibility of transcendentals applied to being, applied to substance. All of that indented stuff in the middle, starting with now in things, that's not about action, not directly. So he spends most of his time just laying out the privation theory of evil. The question is, how do we apply it to action? That's answered in the first line. In the very first sentence, he gives the claim. And assuming that first claim is true, then all we need to do is run this explanation of the privation theory of evil, and we have it for action. So all we're really doing in this article is going back to the thing we've seen before in question 8 with convertibility, and now talking about it specifically in terms of evil. First line, we must speak of good and evil in actions as of good and evil in things. Sicut et, just as also. Because such as everything is, such is the act that it produces. Now I want to pause just a little bit on the Latin here. The Latin is very, very clear that I have in parentheses, but it's not the easiest thing to render into English. You have to either violate the word order, which is what the English translator has done there, that I've given first, or you have to mess around a little bit with the way you render words like qualis. It's a little bit hard to find a natural way to do it. There's going to be some level of interpretation in the English. But if you know Latin, it's easy. It's something, very slavishly, literally. It's any one thing whatsoever, una quaeque res talem actionem producit, produces such an action, talem actionem producit, qualis est ipsa. What kind of thing it is, it itself is. So that's a little bit goofy. My alternative rendering at the bottom, everything produces an action or action corresponding with what kind of thing that it is. One kind of thing, corresponding kind of action. Another kind of thing, correspondingly different kind of action. This is all you need to justify the move from being the convertibility argument applied to things and the convertibility argument applied to substances, or to actions rather. We speak of them the same because such as everything is, such is the act that it produces. This is a very surprising application of question 6, Article 1. This is part of what we mean when we say that the actions that we care about in ethics are the ones that come from within. They are in some sense us, an overflow of our own existence, of our own being, an extension of our being. They're in part who we are, or an outreach of who and what we are. You could try to explain this in a number of ways, and whichever way you go to try to explain what Aquinas is doing, you're going to betray very quickly what school or brand of Thomism you subscribe to. But very broadly, this is what is being captured by the famous medieval slogan, aphorism, agere sequitur esse, or agere sequitur esse. To act follows to be, or sometimes action follows being, although those are infinitives. It's one of the most famous ways to summarize Aquinas and indeed a lot of generically medieval philosophy, other thinkers from the time period. In some way, all of our action follows upon our esse. It flows directly from our esse, our existence, that we are. Our esse is the first of our acts. It's the act of all acts that makes all other act possible. All action proceeds from it. And because of that, because our action is just an overflow of our esse, well, we can speak of good and evil in action just as we speak of it in things. Maybe there's more to say there. Aquinas does talk about this a little bit more length in the De Malo, but not a lot. It's an idea to grapple with and spend some time with. What is really happening when we act? And it'll start to feel a little mystical when you try to get into it a little more closely. But fundamentally, this is the deep claim at the foundation of our physics to ethics moves that we've made over and over again, very much like the convertibility thesis itself. Now, given that this is true, or if this is true, then everything that follows just has to be a treatment of good and evil in things. And that's exactly what we get. So now we're looking at the formatted text at the center of the Respondeo. Now in things, each one has so much good as it has being, since good and being are convertible. No surprise there. We've seen this one many times this year. I've omitted, in the brackets there, I've just omitted the citation. He's referring back to the first time he gave the convertibility argument in the Summa, in Prima Pars, question 5, which I taught my students when they were in 9th grade. Back to the text. But God alone has the whole plenitude of his being, his esse, in a certain unity, whereas every other thing has its proper fullness of being in a certain multiplicity. The first claim is just a claim of divine simplicity, the very first divine attribute that Aquinas ever derives after he's finished his 5 ways, is that God is simple. He's not composed of parts in any way. He's just one. And then he actually looks at the unity of God in a separate question as well. Turns out one is a transcendental of being, and in some sense we're combining transcendentals now. We're drawing on this other one. So hopefully that middle expression is not much of a surprise. We've said many things about this over the years. And God is totally unlike all created things. If a thing is created, it is composite, somehow. It's made of parts. What's lurking here is what's sometimes called the first Thomistic thesis, right? That all being is divided such that it is either pure act or a mixture of act and potency. And that's essentially what we're looking at here. There's God and there's everything else. There's the perfectly simple, and there are things that are composite, or as it says here, the fullness of being exists in a certain multiplicity. You could connect this to what we just said about the talus qualis claim on the previous slide, about given such a kind of thing, such as its action. Right? And you can already see where this is going to go. Because we are composite, in some way our action is composite. Aquinas doesn't bother with this here, but we could also pursue the other line, right? We could pursue the line, because God is one and simple, his action must be one and simple as well. But that's bonus. That's for fun when we're not trying to do ethics. For us, the key claim is the last one. Our fullness of being exists in a certain multiplicity. We are composed of parts. And so it happens with some things that they have being in one respect, and yet they are lacking in the fullness of being which is due to them. This is a mereology. This is a talk of parts and wholes. The fullness of being, the whole human being, requires a compound of soul and body, having all the powers and instruments of knowledge and movement. So if you think back to 3 souls and the powers of the soul, our animality, he's identifying the things that make up the fullness of being of human. And if any of those is lacking, or if any of those is not working right, then the whole, the human, is lacking something. So the basic idea here on the right, if a part is missing from the whole, then the whole is missing something. If a part of a whole is broken, then the whole is broken. The easiest way to see this is with artifacts. You crash into my clock, and I say, you broke my clock. It doesn't really make any sense to say, well, no, just the hands and the springs and the pendulum. I mean, if those things are all broken, then the clock is broken. But maybe you crash into my clock and you only break the glass face. And I say, you broke my clock. You say, well, just the glass face, it still works. That's true, but it is broken. It's a lesser kind of breaking, but a part of the clock is broken, or you chip the wood of the grandfather clock or whatever. I agree, it's a different kind of broken, but it's still broken. It's also easier to see with living things. Right? The difference between a sick dog and a healthy dog. This dog needs medical attention. That dog just needs to be let outside. You just have to know what kind of thing you're dealing with. What is it? What is its nature? What is its end? And if you know that, then you know what's supposed to be there. And if any of those things are missing or deficient in some way, then the dog is sick. The dog is injured. The clock is broken. The bridge is unsafe to drive on. If a dog is missing a leg, then you can say, oh, well, there's something wrong with that dog. It's supposed to have 4 legs. Humans are supposed to be bipeds. We're supposed to be able to walk around and do things. If we're injured in a car crash or in a war and can no longer walk, we're injured. We're broken. Now, that just means part of us is broken, and that does mean that the whole is broken. You can't say, well, I'm healthy except for the lung cancer. You can say it, but it's a little silly, right? I'm healthy in every respect except for the lung cancer. Well, then you're not healthy. You're healthy in some ways and not in others. That's reasonable. This is actually true for my father-in-law, right? He's healthy in every way except for his heart was a ticking time bomb. Right? It happens. It's the way we break. We break in lots of different ways. Now, Aquinas' example here is what I meant by terminological baggage. It's one of the times, because he likes to use the example of blindness. So his example of a human that's missing something that it's supposed to have is a blind man. Humans are supposed to be able to see. If you're blind, you're missing something that you're supposed to have as a human. You are, as he says, possessed of goodness inasmuch as he lives, and of evil inasmuch as he lacks sight. So he doesn't quite say blind people are evil. That's not quite what he says. But it's easy for us to hear that in English, and you got to be careful there. It is evil for us to be blind. It is bad for us to be blind. You know, if you get acid splashed in your eyes and can't see for the rest of your life, we don't say, oh, interesting variation on the human form. We say you're injured. Or something. It's bad. It's bad that you're blind. Yeah. It's not that the blind man is morally evil. It's not that, man, how dare you? He is suffering an evil as opposed to committing one. Yeah. And this is the physical, moral evil distinction. These are physical evils, evils of things, of substances, of moving things. Now, the final line here, which I don't want to spend much time on, is just Aquinas clarifying something about the privation theory that we will see in one of the replies as well. If you've got nothing there, absolute privation, absolute negation, so that there is no being or goodness, then you don't have good or evil because you don't have a thing. Evil is only said of existing things. It's a privation inhering in a thing. So absolute privation, absolute negation isn't evil. It just means there's no human there, or there's no dog there, or there's no action there. Here's the summary, and it's a very important formula for the future in Articles 2 through 4. Since the same fullness of being is the very essence of good, fullness of being and good, that's just what it means, then if a thing be lacking in its due fullness of being, it is not said to be good simply, but good in a certain respect, inasmuch as it does have being. So once again, we see the simply and in a certain respect distinction, from which we first saw in the fear article, question 6, article 6. And here it's important to realize that in a certain respect doesn't necessarily have to be thin. It doesn't have to mean, I mean, it's mostly bad, but there's kind of good. You can say it the other way around. I'm healthy, except for this, except for my eyes. Right? My eyes are pretty terrible. I can't see anything without my glasses on. So am I healthy? Yeah, I mean, mostly, right? In a certain respect, yes. In lots of respects, yes. But in this respect, no, my eyes are not sound. It's really good that we invented eyeglasses or I'd be in trouble. And this talk of good simply if the whole thing is good, and good in a certain respect if parts of it are good, that matters a lot for action. We're going to use that many times in Articles 2, 3, and 4. And don't worry about the parenthetical at the end there, although it can be called being simply and non-being in a certain respect. This is a point that comes up in the convertibility argument. We can talk about that in class if you really want to. He's just saying that the way you say simply and in a certain respect, turns out it can be used differently when you talk about substance than for a substance being good. This is the conclusion. This is just making explicit the connection to action. We've just ended our long treatment of substance, substantial goodness. Now we're going to connect it to action. We must therefore say that every action has goodness, or is good, insofar as it has being, insofar as it exists. Whereas it is lacking in goodness, insofar as it is lacking in something that is due to its fullness of being, and thus is said to be evil. And then he gives some examples, for instance. Don't worry about the for instance right now. We're going to talk about that over the next several articles. What are the parts of the action that make up its fullness of being? That's the question you have to have now. We know that we're looking for parts because actions flow from composite creatures and therefore they are composite. We need those parts to be healthy or sound for the whole action to be healthy or sound. What are those parts? That's Articles 2, 3, and 4. He's going to name them. What we've got here is a really nice treatment of, again, going from substance to action, physics to ethics, and setting us up for our future articles. So it turns out there's not that much difference between substantial goodness and action goodness. There's some. We'll talk about them. But the fundamental way of talking about good and evil is still the same. We are actually, in a way, talking about healthy and sick action, interestingly enough. Now let's look at the replies really quickly. Again, this is more for you as the reader, you as the student, to grapple with them and ask questions about them. It's less about me lecturing them. What we have here, evil acts in virtue of deficient goodness. If there were nothing of good there would be neither being nor possibility of action. You should recognize all of that from the Respondeo. In fact, that's almost exactly what he said in the parenthetical aside that I glossed a minute ago about absolute privation at the end of his privation theory account in the middle. On the other hand, if good were not deficient, there would be no evil. Consequently, the action done is a deficient good. Good in a certain respect, simply evil. This is just Dionysius himself. This is what On the Divine Names goes into after he raises the question. Probably the simplest way to say it for now, for our purposes, is that when you say evil is doing something, or evil acts, evil is acting, what we really mean is that there is a thing acting deficiently. There's a substance, and it really exists, and insofar as it exists, it's good, and it's acting. And insofar as its action exists as an overflow of its being, the action is also good, insofar as it is an overflow of being. But it's bad action, or evil action, insofar as it's missing something. Right? If the good were not deficient, there would be no evil. And so what we're really trying to say is that evil, this is a way of saying that evil is a privation, not a substance. It's not a thing. So you have to be careful when you say evil acts. The second and the third replies are actually very similar. and I thought about just not giving you text here. They are essentially saying complementary things, maybe almost exactly the same thing, one focused on the agent, the other focused on the action. This is in reply to Aristotle's concern. And again, we're actually just elaborating on what Aristotle himself says in the Metaphysics. And it's about the way evil is some kind of potency, or a potency fails to realize. But if a potency fails to realize, then there's no action. So how can there be evil action? Yeah. Yeah, I think Aquinas could have chosen more than one way to address this. I mean, his example is slightly complicated, but nothing hinders a thing from being an act in one way, in one respect, so that it can act, and in a certain respect, in another respect, deficient in act, so as to cause a deficient act. So the defect or the failed actualization of one potency can actually interfere with the operation of another potency that is being actualized and that can be actualized, but it actually becomes an obstacle to the full actualization of the other potency. It's a little complicated. The example is interesting. A blind man has the power of walking and actualizes it. You'll see blind people on the metro or out on the streets. But inasmuch as he is deprived of sight, he does suffer a defect in walking. Walking is harder. He can stumble and fall. Yeah. This is why they need you should help them on the metro. Make sure. This is why we put up the warning sign. The warning messages, not the signs, obviously, but the speaker announcements. Watch out! Don't watch out for the gaps between the cars. Or helping steer them toward the door, or asking them if they need help. Yeah. One failed actualization or one failed realization of a potency is interfering with the actualization of another, which is different than the way you struggle to walk when your legs are broken, right? Or when you're recovering from surgery, which seems like it could be another way that Aquinas addresses this. We can talk about that one in class. The third one, finally, again, similar to the previous one, we're just talking about where do we locate the evil? Where do we locate the failed actualization? Where's the potency? Where's the lack? And the objection itself feels a little bit overly technical, but the reply is really helpful. Evil actions still have their proper effects, according to the goodness and being that the action has. So instead of focusing on the agent, now we're focusing on the action. When we say that adultery is evil and that there's something missing there, I mean, that doesn't mean it ceases to be the cause of human generation. You can still have babies that way, because the action is still the union of male and female. But it's not about its lack, but it does lack the order of reason. That's where the defect is. So lacking the order of reason isn't what's creating the effect. That's the short answer to the objection. The objection is, well, but evil actions still have proper effects, and evil can't be a cause. It's not the evil part, which is the lacking the order of reason, which we'll talk about in question 19, but rather it's the lacking the order of reason is a defect on the base action. The base action still exists. So when we say that an action is missing something that makes it evil, we don't mean that the action ceases to exist or that it ceases to be a cause. Still can. Still can. Now again, all three of these objections and replies, they're more the kind that you need to sit with and think through and ask questions about. It's not really the kind of thing I can easily lecture in a video. Hopefully this has at least pushed you in the right direction toward thinking about them, but we can certainly fight about all of them in class. And by thinking them through, you will get a much better handle on what we mean when we say evil is the lack of a due good. That's it for question 18, article 1. We're going to move on in the next video to question 18, articles 2 through 4, and look at the parts of the action and how they work. And in the meantime, read well, study well. If you've got any questions, you know how to get a hold of me. God bless and stay safe.